Nueva Orleans Massacre, the Mississippi Valley Slave Revolt, 1811, January 1811. In the Mississippi Valley, the sugarcane fields were the scene of unimaginable suffering. Men, women, and children worked under brutal surveillance, supporting the richness of an elite who never imagined losing control. But that night, fear changed sideways. Hundreds of enslaved rose, wielding machetes, sticks, and courage. They marched towards New Orleans, releasing captives and burning plantations. For 2 days, the South trembled. It was the largest slave revolt in the history of the United States. But the answer was merciless. Colonial and militia troops massacred the rebels, and as cruel warning, their heads were exposed in stakes along the Mississippi River, a symbol of terror, but also of resistance. Before continuing, think to me. Today, I speak of the Mississippi Valley, where hope for freedom was crushed with blood. For you, were these men only violent rebels or martyrs who dared to fight slavery? If you believe this story needs to be remembered, subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. The year was 1811, and the Mississippi Valley stretched like an open wound in the American landscape. In the muddy banks of the river that cut the heart of the continent, sugarcane plantations spread like green scars, each fueled by the sweat and blood of thousands of enslaved souls. Louisiana had recently been incorporated into the United States, but practices inherited from the French and Spanish colonizers remained intact, a system of exploration that turned human beings into commodities. In plantations that stretched from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, over 40,000 Africans and African descent lived in subhuman conditions. They woke up before dawn to the sound of whips and bells, worked under the scorching sun cutting sugarcane, grinding sugar, and building the richness of men who would never get their hands dirty. The senzalas were overcrowded barracks where whole families huddled in smaller spaces than animal cura. Children were born already marked by slavery, growing between the sweet smell of molasses and the bitter taste of oppression. The planters, in their granted homes ornate with European furniture and exuberant gardens, lived a parasitic existence. Manuel Andre, owner of the Andre plantation, was one of those men. Cruel and calculating, he ruled his land with iron fist, using whip as a universal language. His slaves were numbered as cattle, marked in hot iron, sold and purchased as objects. Dehumanization was complete and systematic, but even in the darkness of slavery, the spark of resistance never completely erased. In the sugarcane fields, between whispers in African languages mixed with French Creole, rebellion stories circulated as underground fire. Toussaint Louverture was spoken in Haiti, the black man who had defeated the whites and released his island. He spoke of Colombos, of successful escapes, of gentlemen killed by his own victims. These stories planted dangerous seeds in the minds of the oppressed. Charles de Landes was a different man from the other slaves of the Andre plantation. Tall, wide shoulders and penetrating look, he was born in St. Dominic, present-day Haiti, and grown by listening to the stories of the revolution that had released his homeland. Mulatto, son of a white gentleman with a black slave, Charles occupied a peculiar position in the plantation hierarchy. It was the driver, the black overseer who supervised the work of other captives. But unlike many who accepted this position as a privilege, Charles saw his function as an opportunity. For months, he had secretly organized a resistance network that spread through the plantations of the Mississippi Valley. On new moon nights, when darkness protected the movements, Charles met with other captive leaders. Quash, an African Yoruba of huge strength. Cook, a Creole who knew how to read and write. Harry, a blacksmith who could forge improvised weapons. Together they planned the unthinkable, a revolt that would free all the slaves from the valley and march to New Orleans. The plan was bold and desperate. They would start at Plantation Andre, would kill the lord and their henchmen, take the weapons of the big house, and march on property, freeing captives and burning the plantations. The idea was to create a human snowball that would grow until it became an unstoppable avalanche. New Orleans, with its population mostly black and mulatto, would be the final destination. There they would proclaim freedom and establish a black republic in the heart of slave America. The news that came from Haiti fed the hope of the conspirators. Toussaint Louverture had proved that blacks, they could beat the whites, that slavery was no inevitable destination, that freedom was possible for those who had the courage to fight for it. In addition, rumors about tensions between Americans and Spanish in the region suggested that authorities were distracted by political issues, creating a window of opportunity for the rebellion. Charles knew there would be no second chance. The revolt needed to be fast, brutal, and decisive. Hesitation would mean massacre, and massacre would mean that future generations would continue in the currents. On the night of January 8, 1811, he last gathered his companions as slaves. The next day, they would be free or killed. The dawn of January 9, 1811 began as any other in the Andry plantation, but the air carried an electrical tension that only the initiates could see. Charles de Landes woke up before the bells, his fixed eyes on Mississippi's hazy horizon. He knew that this would be the last day of his life as a slave. Either it would die free or would die trying to be free. There was no third option. The signal had been combined, a cry of revolt followed by the sound of axes breaking doors. At 5 in the morning, when the slaves went to the fields for another day of forced labor, Charles gave the command. In a matter of minutes, Plantation Andry has become a battlefield. The rebels broke into the big house, killed Manuel Andry to blows from Machado, and seized the weapons stored on the property. Harpsing, pistols, sabers, and ammunition went from the hands of oppressors to those of the oppressed. The news of the rebellion spread like fire on dry straw. Plantation after plantation was taken by the insurgents, who released the slaves and burned the facilities. With each property won, dozens of new rebels joined the march. Men who had spent their entire lives curved over the sugarcane fields now wielded weapons and shouted words that they have never dared to pronounce. Freedom, revenge, death to you. The rebel column grew like a human serpent feeding on his own fury. 500, 600, 700 men marched toward New Orleans, leaving behind a trail of black smoke that climbed the flat plantations. They carried improvised flags, African tambourine echoed through the fields, and war songs in tongues that whites did not understand echoed through the valley. It was an army of slaves transformed into liberation force. Charles de Landes rode in front of the column, mounted on the horse that had belonged to Manuel Andry. His makeshift uniform mixed military pieces stolen with traditional African symbols. Beside him, Quash carried a flag where he was written Mort or la liberté, death or freedom. The march was not just a military man, it was ritual. It was collective catharsis. It was the moment when centuries of humiliation became thirst for justice. Colonial authorities, initially skeptical of the severity of the situation, soon realized that they faced something unprecedented in American history. Messengers desperately rode to New Orleans, bringing terrifying news. The slaves had risen, were armed, organized, and marching towards the city. Governor William Claiborne, pale as paper, called the militia and called for federal help. For the first time in decades, the whites of the Mississippi Valley felt the true meaning of the word fear. Governor William Claiborne did not sleep on the night from 9 to 10 January. In his office in New Orleans, maps spread over the mahogany table as he coordinated the response to the rebellion that threatened to destroy the entire social structure of Louisiana. The news that arrived were increasingly alarming. Entire plantations had been burned, masters murdered, and an army of rebel slaves marched inexorably towards the city. The New Orleans militia was mobilized immediately. 300 white men, armed with muskets and cannons, set out to dawn to intercept the rebels. Commanded by Major Milton, veteran of Indian wars, the military force had a crucial advantage: discipline and superior weaponry. But it faced an enemy moved by despair and thirst for freedom, feelings that turn ordinary men into relentless warriors. The decisive meeting took place in the fields near the plantation of the Outstroke, about 20 miles of New Orleans. Charles de Landes had positioned his men in a formation that copied the military tactics he had observed for years serving whites. But the military inexperience of former slaves soon proved fatal. When the militia cannons began to fire, the rebellious formation quickly disintegrated. Men who had never faced artillery spread in panic, becoming easy targets for militia musks. The battle. It was a unilateral massacre. The rebels, armed mainly with agricultural tools and some stolen weapons, could not compete with military discipline and the superior weaponry of government forces. Charles de Landes tried to regroup his men, riding from side to side, but the casualties accumulated quickly. Quash was hit by a cannon bullet that literally broke it in half. Harry the blacksmith fought to the last sigh before falling drilled by dozens of bullets. When the paint's smoke dissipated, the field was covered with black bodies. 66 rebels had been killed in combat, their lives lost in the struggle for freedom their children and grandchildren would only know decades later. Charles de Landes, wounded but still alive, was captured along with dozens of other survivors. The dream of the revolution was over blood and defeat. The captive's nightmare was just beginning. The bodies of the dead were left inserted in the countryside, crow's pasture, and other carnious animals. It was a clear message. Rebels did not even deserve the dignity of a Christian burial, but the revenge of whites would not be satisfied with the military victory. What would come next would be a demonstration of cruelty calculated to terrorize any slave who dreamed of freedom. The whites' justice did not know mercy when it came to rebellious slaves. Charles de Landes and his surviving companions were taken back to the plantations where they had started the revolt, not for judgment, but for exemplary execution. What happened in the days following the battle was recorded in the collective memory of the slaves of the Mississippi Valley as a nightmare of unprecedented cruelty. Charles de Landes, the leader of the rebellion, received the most barbaric treatment. In the plantation where everything had begun, he was tied to a tree before hundreds of forced slaves to watch. First, they cut their hands. They had wielded weapons against you. Then his legs were broken with hammers, each blow accompanied by the screams of pain that echoed through the sugarcane fields. Only then, after hours of torture, Charles was shot dead in the head. But his agony did not end with death. The body of Deslandes was publicly quartered. His head was separated from the trunk, his flesh burned, and his bones left to the vultures. But the horror did not stop there. The colonial authorities decided that simple death was not enough to discourage future rebellions. It was necessary something that would mark the memory of slaves forever, to remind them daily from the price of insubordination. The head of the dead rebels were placed in stakes along the road that bordered Mississippi, from Plantation Darhan to New Orleans. 95 heads in different stages of decomposition, exposed to the sun, rain, and crows. Each represented a dream of freedom transformed into a nightmare of terror. The travelers who traveled the road saw their empty eyes first, then the downstairs skulls, finally only bones bleached by time. For slaves who were forced to work in the nearby fields, the heads were a constant and haunted presence. Children grew seeing those remains swing in the wind, learning from an early age that the rebellion led not only to death but to eternal dishonor. Mothers told whispered stories about the men who had dared to dream of freedom, transforming Charles Mildes and his companions into mythical figures of resistance and warning. The macabre exhibition lasted months. Even when only bones left and some hair stuck to the skulls, the stakes remained as monuments to terror. It was psychology of high fear to cruel art. Every patterned head was a silent promise that the same fate was awaiting any slave who dared to question the established order. The Mississippi Valley had become an open-air cemetery, where freedom was a crime punished with torture and posthumous dishonor. Paradoxically, the brutal repression of the 1811 revolt did not bring the tranquility that slaves expected. On the contrary, the uprising had revealed a terrifying truth that would never leave their minds again. They were a minority in the midst of a population that hated them mortally. In the plantations of the Mississippi Valley, the whites found that they slept on a volcano that could explode at any time. Paranoia was installed as an epidemic between the slave elite. Gentlemen who once walked alone for their properties now have always been armed and accompanied by foremen. The big homes were transformed into fortresses, with grid windows, reinforced doors, and weapons hiding places. Whole families of owners have moved temporarily to New Orleans, leaving their plantations under of militarized administrators. The surveillance system was intensified in a draconian way. Night patrols roamed the rural roads, investigating any suspicious movement. Slaves were prohibited from gathering in larger groups than 5 people, even for religious activities. Possession of knives, axes, or any tool that could serve as a weapon was rigidly controlled. Even African drums were banned, as authorities feared that they could be used for communication between distant properties. Distrust has poisoned the relations between masters and slaves irreversibly. Owners who previously proud of knowing their family captives now saw a killer potential on each black face. Domestic slaves, which traditionally enjoyed greater confidence, were observed with constant suspicion. Cooks were watched so that they did not poison the food. Babysitters were away from white children. Drivers lost the right to carry weapons, even to protect the bosses. Fear also manifested itself in increasingly severe legislative measures. The Louisiana Black Code was dramatically hardened, forbidding slaves to learn to read and write, limiting their movements and increasing penalties for minor crimes. Any slave found outside the property without written pass was automatically considered fugitive and could be killed in the act. The religious education of the captives was placed under the strict control of the church, with mandatory sermons on obedience and submission. But perhaps the most revealing was the psychological terror that consumed whites at night. Many gentlemen developed chronic insomnia, jumping from bed to the slightest noise. Poisoning stories, mysterious fires, and suspicious accidents circulated among owner families, such as macabre urban legends. The revolt had planted in the mind of the oppressors the certainty that their victims would never forget, never forgive, and would wait patiently for the next opportunity for revenge. The Mississippi Valley had become a place where fear had no specific color. It terrified black and white, slaves and gentlemen, victims and tormentors. In the years following the 1811 massacre, a silent conspiracy took shape among the Louisiana authorities. The Charles de Landes revolt needed to be erased from official memory. It was too dangerous to be remembered, very inspiring to be taught, excessively revealing about the contradictions of American slave society. Thus began a systematic campaign of forced forgetfulness that would last more than a century. The newspapers of the time, controlled by the white elite, drastically minimized the extent and importance of rebellion. What had been the greatest slave revolt in American history was described as a minor disorder, unruly slave riot, or simply isolated incident. The number of participants was deliberately underestimated, the organization of the revolt was denied, and the leadership of Charles de Landes was practically erased from the records. Officially, the rebellion had no heroes, just criminals. Government documents about the episode have been classified or simply lost over the decades. Correspondence between Governor Claiborne and Washington, military reports on repression, lists of dead and wounded, all mysteriously disappeared from state files. When historians tried to rebuild the events decades later, they found systematic gaps in documentation, as if someone had deliberately removed evidence. In Southern schools and universities, the revolt was completely omitted from history curricula. Generations of students grew up unknowingly that hundreds of slaves had marked freedom on American soil. When the episode was mentioned, it was always distorted. The rebels were presented as bloodthirsty savages manipulated by external agitators, never as men fighting oppression. The official narrative turned victims into villains and oppressors into civilizing heroes. The church also actively participated in the historical erasure. Sunday sermons preached that slavery was divine will and that rebellions represented sin against God. The figure of Charles de Landes, when mentioned, was demonized as an instrument of the devil. Missionaries who worked with slave populations received specific instructions for never mentioning successful discharge in the Caribbean or historical rebellions, focusing exclusively on messages of submission and patience. Even in the oral tradition of Black communities, the history of revolt was gradually silenced. The terror of reprisals was so deep that parents avoided telling their children about Charles de Landes and their companions. What had started as inspiration has become an unused collective trauma. The heads in the piles had fulfilled their macabre purpose, not only terrified a generation, but poisoned the memory of the following generations. Only in the 20th century, with the movement for civil rights and the development of a more inclusive history, the 1811 revolt began to be rediscovered and studied seriously. But the damage was already done. One of the most important struggles for freedom in American history had been almost completely erased from national consciousness, leaving a void in collective memory that was not fully filled today. More than 2 centuries have passed since the heads of Charles de Landes and his companions were exhibited at the stakes along Mississippi. But the legacy of the 1811 revolt continues to echo in American history as a suffocated cry that refuses to be completely silenced. What began as an attempt at historical erasure gradually became a rediscovery, reinterpretation, and late recognition of a fundamental episode in the struggle for freedom in the United States. During the 1960s civil rights movement, activists such as Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panthers rediscovered the figure of Charles de Landes as a symbol of Black resistance. His words and actions were recontextualized not as a wild rebellion, but as a legitimate struggle against systemic oppression. Historically, Black universities began to include the 1811 revolt in their curricula, presenting discounts as a forerunner of liberation movements that would culminate with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Contemporary historians, armed with more sophisticated methodologies and access to previously restricted files, were able to rebuild fascinating details of the rebellion. It was found that the organization was much more complex than imagined, involving communication networks between plantations, elaborate strategic planning, and connections with abolitionist northern movements. Charles de Landes emerged not as an impulsive leader, but as a political strategist who perfectly understood the contradictions of the American slave system. Modern Louisiana finally officially recognized the historical importance of revolt. In 2011, exactly 200 years after the massacre, the state raised monuments in memory of the rebels and established the path of slave revolt as a historical tourist route. The same roads where they once were showed overwhelmed heads now receive visitors interested in learning about resistance and struggle for freedom. What was a symbol of terror became a place of memory and reflection. Internationally, the 1811 revolt gained recognition as part of the global history of the struggle against slavery and colonialism. Academics from African and Caribbean universities have established connections between the nonsense tactics and strategies used by leaders, such as Toussaint Louverture in Haiti and Zumbi dos Palmares in Brazil. What seemed to be an isolated episode was part of a transnational movement of resistance to Atlantic slavery. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of revolt is its ability to inspire contemporary reflections on justice, resistance, and social change. At a time where movements like Black Lives Matter question oppression structures that persist centuries after the formal abolition of slavery, the figure of Charles Deslandes resurfaces as the timeless symbol of refusal to accept systemic injustice. The heads in the piles no longer exist, consumed by time and the elements. But the memory of those men who preferred to die free to live enslaved remains alive, transmitted from generation to generation, inspiring struggles that have not yet ended. Nueva Orleans Massacre has transformed, paradoxically, a posthumous victory. The attempt to erase the history of Black resistance failed, and today, Charles Deslandes occupies his legitimate place in the pantheon of American heroes who fought for freedom when she was still a crime punished with death.